The snowstorm had teeth. It howled down the switchbacks of White Ridge Pass like a living thing, ripping through the pines and slamming against Officer Eli Walker's windshield. The patrol SUV groaned as it climbed the icy road, tires crunching with each cautious turn. Visibility was trash, just a wash of white and shadows. But Eli knew this stretch better than anyone. He grew up in these mountains. And tonight, something felt off. He flicked on the high beams, nothing but wind-whipped snow and trees bowed under weight. Then he saw it. A shape, low to the ground, just off the roadside. At first it looked like a rock, or maybe a pile of branches caught in the drift. But instinct made him hit the brakes. The SUV skidded slightly before stopping. Eli grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the bitter cold, snow hitting him sideways like needles. He trudged through thigh-high drifts toward the figure, and froze. It wasn't debris. It was a dog, a German shepherd, huge, male, and absolutely still except for the trembling of his flanks. The animal was bound to the earth by 4 thick iron stakes, one to each leg. Heavy chain links ran taut from his ankles to the frozen ground. Blood soaked the snow beneath him. Clumps of matted fur were fused with ice. And yet the dog didn't fight, didn't growl, didn't even flinch when Eli approached. He just turned his head and looked at him. Eli had seen fear before, human, canine, all of it. But this was something else. The dog's eyes didn't plead. They mourned, as if he'd already given up. "Oh my God," Eli whispered, dropping to his knees. His gloved hands moved fast, fingers fumbling for the pocket knife he always carried. The cold bit deep as he sawed through the ropes. The metal cuffs had dug into raw, wet skin. Whoever did this knew exactly how to break a body without killing it. Yet. "You're okay," Eli murmured, not sure who he was trying to convince. "I've got you. You're not dying here." The shepherd gave the faintest whimper. His breath was shallow, labored. There was blood in the foam at his mouth. As Eli freed the last leg, the dog collapsed sideways into his arms. Eli caught him just before he hit the ground, wrapping him in the emergency wool blanket from the SUV. The weight of him was staggering. Not just in size, there was something deeper, like carrying a soldier off the battlefield. Then it happened. Headlights pierced through the whiteout, cutting across the road behind Eli. A black SUV crept into view, silent, unmarked, riding too smooth for the terrain. Eli turned, still kneeling in the snow, clutching the broken shepherd. The vehicle slowed. Inside, behind the frost-rimmed glass, a man sat behind the wheel. Mid-40s, pale, angular face like cut stone. His eyes locked onto Eli. No wave, no expression. Just a look that said, "I know exactly what you found." And then the SUV rolled on, disappearing into the storm. Eli stood frozen, heart pounding, snow swirling around him like ghosts. He carried the dog to the patrol car, laid him gently across the back seat, and turned the heater up, full blast. The dog's sides barely moved. Each breath felt borrowed. Eli slid behind the wheel, jaw clenched. That SUV had been coming from the same direction, from this exact spot. This wasn't an accident. That man wasn't lost in the mountains. Someone left this dog to die, and someone else just watched me save him. As the SUV crawled back down the mountain, Eli checked the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting the black vehicle to reappear. It never did. But the image of that driver, so calm, so sure, stayed with him. Back in town, the snow was still falling, but gentler now. The lights of White Ridge glowed faintly behind fogged glass. Eli pulled into the emergency bay behind the local vet clinic and jumped out. Dr. Hannah Cole met him at the door, already pulling on gloves. "Jesus," she breathed when she saw the bundle in his arms. "What happened to him?" Eli's voice was tight. "Someone staked him down to die." Hannah stepped aside, leading him into the sterile light of the exam room. "Set him here. Let's work." As she began cutting away the blood-soaked fur, she frowned. "This isn't just abuse," she said. "These are precision injuries, like he was trained through pain." Eli looked at the shepherd again. His breathing was shallow but steady. He hadn't made a sound since the rescue. No panic, no resistance, only that mournful, resigned stillness. Who would do this to a dog? Hannah muttered. That question echoed in Eli's mind. But deep down, he already knew. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was a program. And Shadow, he'd already named him that because he moved like one, wasn't just a victim. He was evidence, and someone, somewhere, wanted him gone. Quietly. Permanently. Eli tightened his grip on the edge of the table. Whoever left this dog out there expected him to disappear into the snow. They were about to find out they'd failed. The clinic lights were too bright. Eli stood in the corner of the exam room, soaked in snowmelt and silence, watching as Dr. Hannah Cole worked on the dog's broken body. His gloves were still damp from when he'd carried the shepherd in, his fingertips numb, though he wasn't sure if it was the cold or the way the dog had looked at him. Not with fear, not even with pain, just acceptance. The kind that sits behind the eyes of something that's been through more than it should. Hannah's hands moved quickly but gently. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose knot, strands falling around her focused face. She muttered to herself in the shorthand of someone trained to keep things alive in the worst conditions. Before returning to her hometown of Whiteridge, she'd spent years as a field medic in Afghanistan. She'd seen things, done things most people couldn't imagine. But even she looked shaken. Male, German shepherd, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Underweight but strong. Good teeth, still responsive. Barely, she said without looking up. Whatever he's been through, it wasn't quick. Eli nodded once, his jaw tight. His service radio sat silent on his belt. He hadn't called it in. Not yet. He didn't trust what would happen if he did. Hannah continued working, cutting away blood-matted fur, checking reflexes. The room smelled of antiseptic and wet dog. Every so often, the shepherd whimpered, a raw, small sound that broke the space between heartbeats. "Look at these lacerations," she said quietly. "They're deliberate. Strap marks, multiple layers, like reinforcement training gone wrong. Not a fight, not a wild animal. This was repeated trauma." "Systematic," Eli said. Hannah glanced at him, her face unreadable. "Yeah, like someone was trying to reshape him." As she examined the dog's rear leg, her fingers stopped. She leaned in, brow furrowing. "There's something under the skin here, not scar tissue." She reached for a scalpel, made a precise incision, and gently pried apart the flesh. Eli stepped closer. His pulse ticked louder. With tweezers, Hannah lifted a metallic object no larger than a coin from beneath the shepherd's skin. It was sleek, dark silver, with faint etchings along the edge. Blood clung to its surface. "That's not veterinary," she said. Eli's gut turned. "Is it a chip?" Hannah dropped it into a tray with a soft clink. "It's not a pet tracker, if that's what you're asking. I've removed hundreds of those. This is military grade or something close. It's not meant to help find him. It's meant to control him." The room felt smaller now, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. Eli looked at the dog, at the rise and fall of his chest, slow and stubborn. "He wasn't lost," Eli said. "He was left." Hannah pressed gauze against the incision and taped it quickly. "Whoever did this didn't expect him to survive." "He did," Eli said. "Somehow." He knelt beside the exam table. The dog opened one eye, bloodshot and heavy. Their eyes met again. This time there was something different. Not hope, exactly, but presence. He was still here. "What do we call him?" Hannah asked softly. Eli looked at the snow still clinging to the dog's fur. The way he moved like smoke, like something that had slipped past death and wasn't quite sure what to do with the second chance. "Shadow," he said. Hannah nodded once. "Fits." Eli stood and pulled out his phone. "I need help figuring out what this chip is. I know a guy, Travis Stone. Works out of Bozeman now. Does freelance diagnostics for tech firms. Grew up with me in White Ridge. If anyone can crack this thing open, it's him. Send him everything," Hannah said. "But keep it close. If whoever implanted that is looking for him, they'll want it back." "I already saw him," Eli muttered. "Up there, after I cut the last chain. Black SUV, no plates, just sitting there watching, like he knew exactly what I'd done." They were quiet for a long moment. "You going to report this?" Hannah finally asked. "Not yet," Eli replied. "Sheriff Darnell will shelf it. Call it trespass or animal cruelty and move on. But this is something else." She looked at him. "You're thinking something organized." "I'm thinking that dog's not just a victim. He's evidence, living, breathing evidence, and if someone's willing to torture and dump him in a blizzard, they won't think twice about coming back to finish the job." Hannah took off her gloves, her fingers pale from hours of pressure. "Then you'd better not leave him alone." "I wasn't planning to." Shadow stirred again, one paw twitching beneath the blanket. Eli reached out, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. "You've been through hell," he murmured, "but you're still standing. That makes two of us." Hannah smiled faintly. "You two make a good pair." Eli didn't answer. He was still watching the shepherd. Somewhere up that mountain, someone had tried to erase this animal, but they failed. And now that Shadow was still breathing, Eli knew one thing for sure. They'd come looking. He just didn't know when. The chip sat in a glass Petri dish, blood cleaned off, but the weight of it seemed heavier than anything Eli had ever carried on duty. He watched Travis Stone lean over his cluttered workbench, scanning the strange metallic implant with a microscope, while a tangle of wires and diagnostic tools hummed softly in the background. The air in Travis's garage-turned-lab smelled like solder and old coffee. Outside, the wind beat lightly against the siding. Snow still drifted down, gentler now, but the cold had dug in for the long haul. Travis hadn't changed much, slightly more grey in his beard, glasses thicker, but the same fast mind. He'd done contract work for drone manufacturers, defense contractors, and even a cybersecurity firm out of Seattle. He wasn't flashy, but he had a reputation for finding things no one else could. "Okay," Travis said, adjusting the lens. "First off, this isn't just some tracking chip. Whoever made this wasn't just tagging animals, they were engineering them." Eli leaned in. "Engineering how?" "There's a subroutine embedded in the microcircuitry. Most animal chips are passive. This one's active. It's sending signals constantly. Based on what I'm seeing, it was designed to override normal pain responses. Basically, it tricks the nervous system, dampens pain, suppresses certain reflexes, and can push performance past what's natural." Eli stared at the tiny chip, silent. Travis kept going. "There's training loop code in here too, conditioning software. Looks like they built a program to teach through repeated stimuli, reward and punishment, reinforced commands embedded into response patterns." "You're saying," Eli said slowly, "this thing was used to turn Shadow into a soldier?" Travis nodded. "A biological one, with hardware guiding his instincts?" A quiet fell over the room. Somewhere in the corner, a space heater clicked as it tried to fight off the mountain air. Eli's thoughts ran hot. That empty look in Shadow's eyes when he first found him, the resignation, it hadn't been because he was broken. It was because he had been used. "How many of these things do you think are out there?" Eli asked. Travis frowned. There's more. I saw references in the code. Unit markers. This wasn't a one-off. Whatever this is, it's a program. Shadow might have been one of dozens, maybe more. Eli pressed a hand to his forehead. The storm in his gut was growing louder. You need to be careful, man. Travis added. If someone finds out you have this chip, they already know. Eli said. I saw him. Black SUV, no plates. Just watched me. Didn't say a word. Then he's not alone. When Eli got back to the clinic, the first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the tense, expectant kind. Inside, Shadow lay curled in a fleece-lined crate, resting but not asleep. His ears perked the second Eli stepped in, and those amber eyes tracked every movement. Hannah met him at the door, drying her hands. He's more alert today, eating a little, but he's twitchy, reacts to sounds the others barely notice. Eli glanced toward the crate. What kind of sounds? Anything sharp, metallic. A dropped tray, the buzz of the X-ray machine, even the clank of keys. She lowered her voice. It's like they trigger something. Eli crouched beside the crate. Shadow sat up, stiff but watching. He reached forward slowly, palm up. Shadow sniffed it once, then nudged into his hand. You remember things, don't you? Eli whispered. Not just smells or commands. You remember what they made you do. Shadow didn't move, but his ears flicked back slightly, eyes locked onto Eli's. Then a sharp clang echoed from the back room, someone dropping a tray. Shadow jolted, not with fear, but with reflex. In one fluid motion, he launched to his feet, legs braced, ears forward, body trembling, not from pain, but from readiness. Combat mode. It passed in seconds. Hannah stepped out, startled. I told you, she said. It's like he's wired to respond, not like a normal reaction, like training. Eli stood slowly, something shifting in his chest. Shadow had been programmed to respond to violence, to rise and react when pain should have stopped him. And even now, recovering, his instincts were still tuned like a weapon left cocked. He's not just injured, Eli said. He's conditioned. Later that night, Eli sat alone in the quiet back office of the clinic, the chip sitting on the desk in front of him. Outside, snow coated the windows in soft frost. Shadow slept nearby, curled in a tight ball, every now and then letting out a low, muffled growl, like a dream was chasing him. Eli stared at the device again. It didn't look like much, a sliver of metal and wires, but it held a storm inside. And Shadow, he wasn't just recovering, he was relearning how to be a dog, how to exist outside of commands and punishment. Eli exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, that someone had built this technology, or that they might be watching, waiting to take it back. The storm on the mountain hadn't been the end. It had just uncovered what had been buried. And something, Eli now knew, was still out there in the snow. Something worse than he imagined. And Shadow was the key to unlocking it all. Sheriff Bill Darnell didn't even look up when Eli stepped into his office. The scent of stale coffee and boot leather hung in the air. A rusted space heater hummed beneath the window, fighting the creeping cold of early dusk. Behind the sheriff's desk, case files were stacked like sandbags, and an old fly fishing calendar still showed last month. Walker, Darnell grunted. His voice was gravel wrapped in bourbon. You're early for the 6-hour shift. I'm not here to clock in, Eli said. He set a small evidence bag on the desk. Inside, the chip gleamed under the overhead light like a piece of polished sin. That got Darnell's attention. He leaned forward and squinted at it. What's this supposed to be? Pulled it out of a German shepherd's leg. Dog was found chained in the mountains during that last blizzard. No ID, no chip registry, nothing. But that? Eli pointed to the bag. That's not veterinary. It's some kind of override tech. Dampens pain, forces response. The dog reacts to sounds like he's been hardwired. This is deeper than abuse. The sheriff leaned back and let out a long, slow breath. You're telling me someone out there is building combat dogs? That we've got a rogue science project hiding in our woods? Jesus, Eli, you hear yourself? I'm not guessing, Bill. I saw the damage, the wounds, the way the dog moves. I had Travis Stone look at the chip. It's real. The code's real. Someone tried to erase this dog and everything he'd been through. Darnell gave a small laugh, low and tired. You're a good cop, Walker. Maybe too good. But you're not a damn whistleblower. Eli didn't flinch. So you're going to ignore it? I'm going to say what needs saying. This town doesn't have the money, the time, or the manpower to chase ghosts up in the snow. If some outfit is playing mad scientist out there, it's not in our jurisdiction. It's someone else's problem. I have evidence, Eli said. I can get more. Darnell's gaze hardened. And you'll end up shot in a ditch with your dog missing. You don't poke beasts you can't. See. Silence stretched between them. Then Darnell reached for a yellow folder and slid a paper across the desk. A suspension notice. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. Eli stared at the document. You're serious. I'm protecting you from yourself, from dragging this department into a fight it can't win. You're protecting them, Eli said flatly. Darnell's lips twitched. I'm protecting Whiteridge. Now hand over the dog. Eli's blood turned cold. Excuse me. You're not cleared to hold evidence, especially not a living one. If that dog is part of something federal, it's their business. Chain of command. Eli stepped forward, voice low. If I hand him over, he disappears. He was never yours to keep. I'm not keeping him. I'm keeping him alive. The sheriff stood now, taller than Eli, broader, but age dulled his edges. Don't make me come to your place and take him by force. Eli leaned in. You come to my place, you better bring more than a badge. They locked eyes. Darnell broke it first. Get out of my office. Eli walked out without a word, the suspension notice left behind. That night, the mountains swallowed them whole. Eli drove north, away from town, away from the lights, up into the hills where his grandfather's old hunting cabin still stood. It hadn't seen heat or repairs in years, but it had a roof, a fireplace, and 4 walls that didn't ask questions. Shadow sat in the back seat, silent, alert, head resting on the top of the passenger seat, watching the road like he understood they weren't just driving, they were retreating. The cabin creaked when Eli opened the door. Dust curled off the floor. A couple of deer antlers still hung above the hearth. He started a fire, boiled water, tossed down an old wool blanket in the corner. Shadow sniffed the place once, then curled up beside the hearth like he'd lived there his whole life. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. Inside, Eli sat on the floor with his back against the wall, arms crossed over his knees, eyes never leaving the fire. He thought about the SUV, the man watching, the silence, the chip, the look in Shadow's eyes when the tray dropped, the way his body moved like a weapon waiting for orders. This wasn't a rescue anymore. It was a choice. They'd been marked now, both of them. And the people behind this? They didn't care about truth. They just cared about erasing it. Shadow stirred in his sleep, a low, breathy whine escaping his throat. Eli slid closer, laid a hand gently on his neck. You're not going anywhere, he said softly. Not again. Outside, something cracked in the woods. Eli stiffened, reached for the pistol on his hip. Only wind, but the message was clear. They were alone. No badge, no backup, no sheriff. Just a wounded cop and a broken dog in a forgotten cabin. And the storm was still coming. The forest had long since taken back the road. Eli's SUV crawled along the old access path, tires crunching over frozen gravel, the trees closing in tighter the farther they went. Shadow stood in the back seat, body stiff, head tilted toward the half-open window. Every few seconds, his nose twitched into the wind. He wasn't just alert. He was tracking. Travis had found something the night before, coordinates buried deep in the chip's code. Not GPS data, but grid references, hidden in a firmware string labeled Unit Alpha Archive. The pattern matched a known military topography grid from older reconnaissance maps. It placed the location 10 miles north of White Ridge, on federal land that hadn't seen official use in over a decade, a place you wouldn't stumble across unless you were meant to. They reached a rusted gate with half a sign still bolted to the chain link. The other half lay in the snow, the words North Ridge Kenneling barely legible beneath flakes and time. Eli cut the engine. The world fell silent except for the wind in the trees and the creak of old steel. Shadow didn't wait for a command. He leapt out as soon as the door opened, nose to ground, tail stiff like a flagpole. Eli followed, boots sinking into crusted snow. The place was bigger than he expected. 3 buildings. One long and low, maybe an office. Another with peeling white siding and a collapsed roof. And the third, a large windowless structure with aluminum walls, sat like a bunker at the edge of the tree line. Shadow led him straight there. The door was chained, but the lock had long since rusted through. Eli forced it open with his shoulder. The air inside was stale and cold, carrying the bitter tang of iron, disinfectant, and something darker. Shadows moved between shafts of light filtering through slits in the siding. A few broken cages lined one wall. Along the other, the remains of a metal examination table sat beneath a corkboard covered in yellowing papers. Eli stepped carefully, sweeping the beam of his flashlight along the walls. Dozens of cages, scratched, bent, dented. Some had bloodstains at the corners. Heavy metal feeding bowls were still inside some of them, the kind you bolt to the frame to keep them from being weaponized. And on the far side, files, crates stacked high, binders in plastic tubs, printed photographs, black and white stills of dogs in training fields, their handlers cropped out. Each dog had a code, Unit 14B, Unit 9D, Unit 7A. Each entry had stats, speed, bite pressure, resistance threshold, training notes, medical logs, termination reports. Eli's stomach turned. This wasn't a kennel. It was a lab with teeth. He picked up one of the photos, dog mid-sprint, mouth open, eyes locked. The number 6C was scrawled in marker on the bottom corner. Behind him, Shadow let out a low growl. Eli turned. The shepherd had walked up to a smaller cage tucked into the far corner. Inside, half covered by dust, was a stainless steel ID plate. Eli wiped it clean. 6C. He froze. Shadow wasn't reacting to the smell. He was recognizing the space. Eli dug through a nearby box and pulled a folder marked Unit 6C, PHX sequence. Inside were reports, early obedience scores, bite sleeve aggression levels, pain resistance charts. Shadow's training curve was off the charts. He didn't plateau where others did. He adapted faster, responded harder, until one red-marked page stopped everything. Behavioral instability. Subject 6C failed final compliance phase. Recommend deactivation. Eli stared at the word. Deactivation. Not euthanasia. Not retirement. Just a cold, clinical deletion. They hadn't just trained him, they'd pushed him past breaking, and when he refused to become what they wanted, they threw him away. He looked back at Shadow, who now stood in the center of the warehouse, ears up, turning in place slowly, like he was scanning ghosts. You weren't meant to survive, Eli murmured. They left you to die because you didn't follow the final command. Shadow turned to him, and in that look, Eli saw something more than intelligence. Defiance. He wasn't a mistake. He was a rejection of everything they'd tried to force on him. Suddenly, a noise cracked from outside. A crunch of snow. Footsteps. Eli dropped the folder and killed the light. Shadow moved silently to his side. A shadow passed across the front window. A flashlight beam swept through the trees. Then a second one. 2 figures. Talking low. Moving with practiced calm. Not hikers. Not cops. Eli crouched beside a crate and slowly drew his sidearm. Shadow dropped into a low stalk, eyes locked on the door. But then the figures passed. Quiet. No breach. Just surveillance. A warning. Eli waited 5 full minutes before he spoke again. They know we're here. Shadow let out a low exhale through his nose. Not panic, just readiness. Eli gathered what files he could. Snapped photos of the cage numbers, the documents, the rows of data. He took the photo of 6C. They left the same way they came. In silence, through snow. Back at the cabin, Eli spread the files across the table while Shadow settled in beside the fire. The dog didn't sleep. Not fully. Every so often, his head would lift, ears twitching. And Eli understood now. Shadow wasn't just recovering from abuse, he was climbing out of programming. They'd tried to erase him, recode him, chain him to something monstrous. But Shadow had done the one thing they didn't plan for. He'd chosen not to obey, and that meant he was dangerous. Not to Eli, but to the people still out there in the snow, the ones who built him, and the ones who wanted him back. The road out of North Ridge was nothing more than a scar through the woods, frozen mud and slush twisting between walls of black pines. The sun had long since dropped, and the first shards of ice were already forming on Eli's windshield. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near his holster. The folders from the abandoned facility sat in the passenger seat, tied together with a piece of cord. Shadow lay in the back, watching the rear window, body tense but silent. They'd said nothing since leaving the compound. The silence wasn't empty. It was loaded with the weight of what they'd seen and the certainty that they weren't alone anymore. Eli glanced in the mirror. Snow drifted across the tail lights, soft, ghost-like. Nothing moved behind them. Still, the hair on his arms stood up. He reached the turnoff toward the highway when the headlights behind him flicked on. One set, then another. "Damn it," he whispered. The first vehicle stayed back, 100 yards maybe, lights dimmed, just visible enough to say, "We see you." Eli gripped the wheel tighter. He didn't speed up. That would confirm he knew. Instead, he let the truck idle down the narrow curve until he reached a fork. One path headed south toward White Ridge, the other cut into the mountains, unplowed, half hidden by fallen branches. He took the mountain road. The SUV behind him followed. Within minutes, another set of lights appeared in the side mirror, closing fast. Eli hit the radio instinctively, then remembered. The sheriff had suspended him. No badge, no channel, no help. The road narrowed. He needed space. Up ahead, the tree line broke into an old service clearing where the snow lay deep and untouched. He swung in hard, headlights slicing through the flurries, killed the engine, and stepped out. The air burned cold in his lungs. Shadow was already out of the car before Eli could speak. The shepherd's hackles were up, teeth bare, body crouched low to the ground. He wasn't barking, just growling, deep and controlled, like something that remembered what came next. 2 black SUVs rolled into the clearing and stopped. 4 men stepped out. All in winter tactical gear, no markings. Their movements were precise, almost military. One of them raised a handlight. "Officer Walker," a voice called out, calm and practiced. "You've got something that belongs to us." Eli said nothing. His hand hovered near his sidearm. "No one needs to get hurt." The man continued. "Turn over the dog and we'll forget the rest." Eli's voice came out low. "You left him to die in the snow. You don't forget that." The leader exhaled, almost disappointed. That's not your concern anymore. The man on his left moved, quick, knife glinting under the beam. Everything happened in seconds. The assailant lunged toward Eli's chest, snow exploding under his boots. Eli pivoted, but the attack came too fast. A blur of black and tan shot past his side. Shadow hit the man mid-stride, jaws locking onto his arm. The sound wasn't a bark, it was impact, muscle against flesh. The man went down, knife spinning away, Shadow's growl echoing through the trees. The others drew weapons. Eli dropped low behind the truck. Fired. Once, a warning. The flash lit the clearing, scattering snow like sparks. "Stand down!" The leader shouted. No one listened. One of the men fired, missing high. The shot cracked through the mountain air. Shadow released the first attacker just long enough to reposition. Then another movement, a second man coming from the flank. Eli turned just as Shadow leapt again, catching the stranger by the shoulder, dragging him down hard. The two rolled, snow turning dark under them. Eli rushed forward, knocking the third man's weapon aside, shoving him back into the SUV door. Metal rang. Another punch, quick and desperate. When the fourth tried to circle around, Shadow lunged again, this time slower, favoring one side. A knife caught his flank, slicing through fur and skin. He staggered, then snapped back, refusing to yield. "Shadow!" Eli shouted. The shepherd turned his head, blood streaking his coat, eyes locked on Eli, still standing, still ready. The attackers finally broke. Two dragged their injured out of the snow, the others covering retreat. Engines roared to life. Tires spun. Within seconds, both SUVs were gone, tail lights swallowed by the storm. Eli ran to Shadow, dropping to his knees beside him. The dog was bleeding from his side, chest rising fast but steady. "Easy, buddy," Eli said, pulling off his jacket, pressing it against the wound. "Stay with me." Shadow didn't whimper. He pressed his head against Eli's shoulder, panting softly, body trembling but eyes steady. Eli swallowed hard. "You saved my life." Shadow blinked once, slow, deliberate. Eli didn't know if he understood the words, but the message passed between them anyway. It wasn't instinct that drove Shadow tonight. It wasn't training or programming. It was choice. Later, after they stitched the wound as best they could back at the cabin, Eli sat near the fire. Files spread out again, blood still on his sleeves. Shadow lay beside him, one paw draped across the floor, tail twitching faintly in sleep. Outside, the storm roared like an ocean. Inside, there was only the sound of breathing, two rhythms, steady and alive. Eli looked at the battered shepherd and felt something shift. Until now, he'd seen Shadow as a victim, proof of cruelty, evidence of what people were capable of doing when they stopped seeing life as sacred. But tonight, that changed. The dog wasn't evidence, he was witness, and he'd spoken in the only language that mattered: loyalty, the kind that doesn't need words. The snow had stopped falling, but the air held its breath. Eli crouched behind the rusting frame of an old semi-trailer, heart pounding slow and heavy. His breath curled out in steady clouds. Beside him, Travis Stone tapped nervously at his phone, eyes locked on the map coordinates they'd extracted from the backup firmware embedded in Shadow's chip. "This is it," Travis whispered. "Same grid signature. This is where they're running the program." Across the clearing stood a squat, concrete warehouse, its windows blacked out, security lights rigged on motion sensors. The only sound was the faint hum of electricity running through the fencing. Shadow was pressed against Eli's side, body low, ears up, every muscle coiled. He hadn't growled, he hadn't barked, but his eyes said everything. He knew this place. They waited. 3 minutes later, the whisper of tires on snow signaled the convoy. 3 black FBI Suburbans pulled up without lights. Agents in tactical gear filed out in practiced silence. The lead, Agent Dana Whitlock, sharp jaw, sharper mind, moved fast across the snow, stopping beside Eli. "You're sure they're inside?" she asked. "Positive?" Eli replied. "And they're not alone." Whitlock gave a short nod. Then into her radio. "Go." The flashbangs hit like thunder. Doors were breached with a battering ram. Boots flooded the perimeter. Eli moved with them, Shadow at his side, no longer a survivor hiding from his past, but a soldier returning to it. Inside, the warehouse looked like a place the world had tried to forget. Rows of metal kennels lined the walls, each one holding a dog. Some stood as the team entered, bodies stiff and trained. Others cowered in the corners, tails tucked, ribs showing. Every dog bore scars. Shadow froze halfway in. He took one sniff, then walked, slow and deliberate, down the line of cages. His tail didn't wag. His eyes didn't blink. He was counting ghosts. Eli followed, gun raised, clearing corners with the agents, the warehouse unfolding in layers. Shipping crates stacked high with muzzle harnesses, sedative vials, training logs, and files. Then they found the room. It was cleaner than the rest. Too clean. A steel desk, a screen still glowing with surveillance footage. And standing behind it, adjusting the cuffs of an immaculate winter coat, was Martin Vex. He looked like a businessman on the way to a board meeting. Expensive boots, slicked back hair, and a calm, curated smile. He didn't raise his hands when the FBI burst in. He just glanced at the dogs in their cages, then at Shadow. "Unit 6C, he said softly. "I was wondering how far you'd make it." Eli stepped forward, fury held in check by training. "Is that what he is to you? A number?" "To the program, yes," Vex said, voice even. "But personally, I always thought he was exceptional. You tortured him. I conditioned him. You left him to die." Vex smiled, thin. "He failed compliance. We can't keep liabilities." Whitlock raised a hand. "That's enough. You're under arrest." "I expected this," Vex said, calmly placing both hands behind his back. "Just know you're disrupting a very expensive project, and we don't take disruptions lightly." 2 agents cuffed him. He didn't resist. Shadow didn't move. His gaze never left Vex. The silence between them was heavier than the sounds of dogs barking, agents shouting, or boots echoing off steel. It was the silence of memory. They cleared the warehouse. Dogs were moved out in crates, some sedated for transport. Others had to be carried. A few, like Shadow, walked on their own. As they exited, one of the younger shepherds in a crate let out a low whimper. Shadow stopped, turned, then barked. Once, clear, strong. The younger dog sat up straighter. The agents paused. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Leadership, recognition. Like Shadow was the one they'd all once followed, and now he was back. Eli watched it happen. Not as an officer, not as a rescuer, but as someone who finally understood the full scale of what had been done to these animals. They weren't just weapons, they were soldiers, broken, stolen, and betrayed. But some still had fight in them. Back outside, Eli stood beside Agent Whitlock as Martin Vex was loaded into the SUV. "He'll lawyer up," she said. "Might even walk. Then we make it public." Eli said, "The footage, the files, the tech. Let people see what he did." Whitlock nodded. "We'll need witnesses." Eli looked down at Shadow. "He's not just a witness," he said. "He's the proof they didn't expect to survive." Behind them, the warehouse of silence still stood. But now, the cages were empty. And the silence was broken. The interrogation room was colder than it needed to be. Not just physically, though the metallic chill in the air clung to every breath, but emotionally. It was a space built to break men quietly. Eli had seen it before. A steel table, a two-way mirror, walls the color of a dying storm. Martin Vex sat across from Agent Whitlock with his hands folded neatly, like he was preparing for a conference call instead of a federal indictment. "You're mistaken," he said calmly, his voice like polished glass. "I didn't hurt anyone. I optimized, enhanced, adapted. Every dog in that facility was a tool of innovation. We weren't torturing them. We were refining them." Whitlock didn't blink. Refining them for what? Vex leaned back. "For survival. For warfare. For efficiency. Do you realize how many human lives we've saved through canine units?" I simply asked the next question. "What if they could do more? Last longer? Obey faster?" Eli stood in the corner, arms crossed, jaw tight. He hadn't spoken yet. He didn't trust himself to. On the floor beside him, Shadow sat, not with the anxious stillness of a dog unsure of its place, but with a quiet dignity. His flank was still bandaged from the knife wound, but he barely flinched. Vex finally looked over, eyes catching on the shepherd like a lab tech assessing an old prototype. That one. He was always a standout. Pain tolerance, learning curve, spatial memory, but unpredictable. Too much attachment. He had the makings of an alpha but lacked obedience. Eli stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "You're wrong." Vex cocked his head, amused. I? He didn't lack obedience. He had judgment, and you hated that because you couldn't control it." Whitlock let Eli move past her and stand by the table. "He disobeyed to protect. That's not failure. That's character." Vex smirked. "Character doesn't win wars, Lieutenant." "No," Eli said, "but it saves souls." For a moment, the room hung in standoff. Then Shadow stood. He walked forward, not commanded, not cued, and stopped 3 feet from the table, gaze locked onto Vex. The man faltered, just slightly. The smirk faded. "You remember me, don't you?" Vex asked, voice lower now. 6C, that's what you were. You were never meant to survive the purge. Shadow let out a low, thunderous growl. Not loud, not wild, but deep, almost ancestral. It vibrated in the air like a war drum buried under years of silence. Then he barked, one sharp, defiant sound that cracked across the room like a gavel. Everyone stopped. Vex blinked. Shadow held his gaze, the burn scars on his back, the stitches in his shoulder, the notched ear. All of it said one thing. "I remember." "I don't need you to understand this," Eli said quietly. "But that bark, that wasn't instinct. That wasn't programming. That was truth." Vex tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "He's an animal." "No," Eli said. "He's my partner." Shadow didn't move. Whitlock stared at the dog for a long beat, then said softly, "We've had hundreds of cases of animal abuse, but this is different. You didn't just hurt them. You erased them. You took names, personalities, and turned them into code. They're dogs." Vex snapped. "They were soldiers." Eli shot back. "They bled for us. Shadow, he didn't break. He carried all of it and still chose to come back." Vex leaned forward, voice hardening. "You people are sentimental. You get attached. That's why your kind loses control." Eli didn't blink. "No, that's why we have something you'll never understand." "What's that?" "Loyalty, not obedience. Loyalty, the kind that doesn't need a leash." He turned toward the door, calling Shadow without words. The shepherd fell into step beside him. Calm. Steady. Like always. Just before they walked out, Eli stopped. "You wanted a perfect weapon," he said over his shoulder. "Instead, you built something stronger. You built a survivor, and he's going to help tear everything you made apart." They left Vex sitting alone in the cold, silent room, the echo of Shadow's bark still hanging in the air. That night, Eli sat on the porch of the safe house. Shadow lay at his feet, eyes closed but ears twitching, sensing every shift in wind, every change in breath. Eli looked at him, not as a rescuer, not as a handler, but as a man who had once nearly given up on everything. "You're not just some story I'll tell," he whispered. "You're the reason it's not over yet." Shadow didn't move, but in the quiet between words, Eli could swear he felt it. The weight of everything they'd both survived, and the promise that some things, once broken, can still choose to stand. Caleb Briggs had been called many things: Marine, enforcer, mercenary, but never traitor. At least not out loud. He wasn't the type people challenged unless they wanted to wake up with missing teeth. He'd once dragged a wounded sergeant 3 miles through Taliban gunfire. He'd seen men at their worst, and worst still, he'd seen himself in a mirror long after the missions were over. Most days, he could silence the ghosts. But that night, watching Shadow drag a bloodied rookie from a burning hallway, he felt something crack. It started with a scream. Not from a human? Not exactly. The building was chaos, FBI flashbangs, shouted commands, barked orders. But beneath it all, there was a different kind of sound. Raw, fierce, and unshakably alive. Shadow. Briggs turned down the corridor just in time to see the German shepherd shove his shoulder into a jammed metal door, teeth clamped around the sleeve of a fallen agent. The man was barely conscious, his leg twisted unnaturally, smoke curling around them like a noose. The dog didn't flinch, didn't wait, just pulled. That was the moment it hit him. They said these dogs were bred for war, for submission, for compliance. But Shadow, he was acting out of choice. Not command, not instinct. Loyalty. And that loyalty wasn't for Vex. Briggs pressed his back against the wall, letting the firefight pass him by for a heartbeat. The weight in his chest wasn't fear. It was memory. He remembered his last deployment. A canine named Dagger had gone missing during a mission gone wrong. They'd written him off. But 3 days later, Dagger came back. Muzzle torn, ribs showing, but tail wagging, and led a team to where 2 wounded soldiers had been left for dead. Briggs hadn't thought about Dagger in years, but now, seeing Shadow move like that, it all came back. He turned toward the lab wing, toward the fire, the smoke, the servers, and toward the truth. Minutes later, Briggs stepped into the secured lower level, where the data center buzzed like a wasp nest. 2 of Vex's private guards were already fried. Tasers and flashlights discarded like broken toys. One of them had tried to delete the logs. Briggs stopped the second. "You really want to be the guy holding the shovel when the world finds this grave?" he asked. The tech didn't argue, just stepped back. Briggs went to work. One by one he pulled hard drives, secured backups, and sealed off access. Surveillance footage, medical files, transport manifests, names, coordinates, transactions, everything. It would all burn Vex to the ground. When he finally stepped out of the smoke-choked basement, his clothes reeked of melted plastic and adrenaline. FBI agents turned weapons on him immediately. "Don't," he said, hands raised. "I'm not here to play games. The data's secure, but it won't stay that way unless someone makes the right call." 2 agents hesitated. Then Eli appeared, Shadow at his side, both limping but alive. Their eyes locked for just a second. 2 men from different wars who had both lost too much. "Why now?" Eli asked. Briggs looked at Shadow. "I saw a dog drag a dying man out of hell. Not because he had to, because he wouldn't leave him behind. And I remembered what it meant to wear the damn uniform." Eli didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Later, back at the command tent, Briggs handed over the last of the files. Test logs, shipment routes, payment chains. Vex had a partner overseas. Biological upgrades, human trials. It's not just dogs. Whitlock froze. "Jesus, this runs deeper than we thought." Briggs lit a cigarette, hand still shaking. You're gonna need more than a raid team. You're gonna need light. Real light. Shadow stepped forward then, tail wagging just slightly, not in approval, but in recognition. Briggs crouched down. You remember me? The shepherd tilted his head, then touched his nose briefly to Briggs's chest. It wasn't affection. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. You're not broken, Briggs whispered. They tried, but you held the line. He stood up, eyes meeting Eli's. I'll testify. I'll name names. Just make sure he doesn't go back in a cage. Eli placed a steady hand on Shadow's back. He never will. Outside, the sun was rising, barely a sliver over the horizon, but enough to mark the difference between night and day. Between what Briggs used to be and who he'd just chosen to become. A man who remembered, and a dog who refused to forget. It started with a snowfall, quiet, steady, and almost too gentle for what had just happened. Whiteridge hadn't seen this much media traffic since a bear wandered into town during the state fair, but today it wasn't wildlife or weather drawing the crowd. It was justice. Federal agents stormed facilities in 5 states simultaneously. Underground labs were dismantled, bank accounts frozen, and handlers arrested. The names Caleb Briggs had provided led to warrants, and the evidence he'd saved lit up a network stretching far beyond U.S. borders. What Vex called biological optimization, the Bureau now called organized cruelty. And the world was finally watching. The dogs, those who had survived, were pulled from darkness and sedated cells. Some would need months of rehabilitation. Others would never be the same. But they were safe now. For the first time in their lives, they were safe. And at the center of it all was one dog. Shadow. He wasn't listed in the official reports. No medals were pinned to his vest. But every agent who'd been there knew. When the building burned, when things went sideways, when lives hung by a thread, it wasn't a man who turned the tide. It was him. Shadow had become more than a survivor. He'd become a symbol. At a small ceremony in Whiteridge's town hall, Mayor Colleen Fisher stepped to the microphone, clearing her throat, hands trembling slightly. We don't have much here in the way of parades, she said, but we know how to recognize a hero. Shadow, on behalf of our town and all the people you protected without a second thought, it's my honor to name you Whiteridge's first ever honorary K-9 officer. Applause filled the room, but Shadow stood still, only his ears flicking at the sound. Eli knelt beside him, whispered something no one else could hear. The dog finally turned, looked out at the small crowd, and gave one soft woof. It was enough. Afterward, FBI Deputy Whitlock pulled Eli aside. You sure about staying here? She asked. We could use someone like you in D.C., counter-bio divisions gearing up fast. Eli glanced at Shadow, who was busy being adored by half the children in town. I appreciate it, he said, but this is home now, for both of us. Whitlock smiled. You ever change your mind, call me, and give that dog a stake on me. I'll give him 2, Eli replied. As the weeks passed, the town settled back into its winter rhythm. Snowplows hummed down Main Street. The diner brought back its Tuesday pot roast special. And Eli began walking the old patrol route again, not for duty, but for peace. Shadow walked beside him, not as a tool, not as a project, but as a partner. Sometimes they'd pass the lake where Rex had once trained, now frozen over. Eli would pause, thinking of Noah, thinking of the boy who had believed in something bigger than commands and collars. And he'd wonder, had Shadow saved them both? The answer came not in words, but in moments. The gentle way Shadow pressed his head against the legs of a teenager in a wheelchair. The way he barked once, low and firm, when a delivery truck sped past a school bus. The way he slept beside Eli's bed, never flinching during the storms. One night, as the snow fell again, Eli strapped on his boots and reached for the leash. Shadow was already at the door, tail wagging. They stepped out into the quiet together, down the empty streets, past the shuttered shops, through the whispering trees dusted in white. And for the first time in a long time, Eli didn't feel the weight of ghosts. He felt the presence of something stronger. Hope. Shadow paused at the bend in the road, ears perked. A breeze swept through the branches. The town was still, watching, healing. Eli crouched beside him. "You ready, partner?" Shadow looked up, eyes gleaming, and nudged his nose into Eli's palm. Not a response. A promise. He had not only been rescued, he had rescued them all. "What about you? Have you ever been saved, physically or emotionally, by an animal who refused to give up on you? Share your story in the comments, and if Shadow moved you like he moved us, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow our journey here at German Shepherd Chronicles. Sometimes the quietest heroes have 4 legs and hearts louder than words.